Ranger's paws locked on the wet asphalt, and the whole funeral behind him jerked to a halt as a low whine climbed out of his throat. Officer Grant Sullivan felt the leash go tight, felt the dog's body angle toward a black sedan at the curb, and heard the crowd on the sidewalk go still. "Ranger," he whispered, "boy, we can't stop here." But the shepherd would not move a single inch. Before we go on, tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so stories like this one keep finding you. The grey Ohio sky pressed low over Millbrook, thick and quiet like a hand held over a mouth. Officer Adam Bishop's flag-draped casket rode slow down Elm Street on the shoulders of 6 pallbearers, and every store on the block had drawn its shades in respect. Bishop had walked that same street in uniform for 19 years. He had ticketed the mayor's teenage son. He had carried the Peterson twins out of a burning kitchen on Prescott Avenue. He had known the name of every barista at the corner diner and had asked after their mothers by name. The town had come out to say goodbye, and the town had brought its silence with it. Sullivan walked behind the hearse in his dress blues, the leash wrapped twice around his fist, and he had promised himself 2 things that morning. He would not cry. He would not let Ranger see him break. Ranger had ridden shotgun in Bishop's cruiser for 7 years before the department reassigned him to Sullivan the winter before, and the dog had been quiet in a way that hurt to watch ever since Bishop had gone, grieving in his own kind of way, waiting at the door of the K9 unit in the mornings, sniffing Bishop's spare uniform in the locker like it might still smell like his old partner if he tried hard enough. Then Ranger stopped. He planted his paws in the middle of Elm Street with all the weight of a full-grown shepherd behind them, 90 pounds of muscle and refusal, and he angled his broad chest toward the black sedan parked at the curb. His nose lifted, his ears came up, and that low whine climbed out of him again, thin and sharp, the exact sound he made in the training yard when he had found what he was hunting. The sedan belonged to Detective Marcus Reed. Reed had been one of Bishop's oldest friends on the department. They had gone through the academy together 24 years back, in a graduating class of 42 rookies. They had stood up at each other's weddings. Reed had been a pallbearer that very morning. Sullivan had watched him carry the weight of the box, with his shoulder pressed against the flag, watched him wipe his eyes at the church, watched him hug Linda Bishop on the steps and whisper something in her ear that had made her nod. Reed had ridden with the family for the graveside portion. He had come back for the procession through town by choice. And now his car sat at the curb, and Ranger would not look away from it. Sullivan's stomach tightened up into a fist. He knew that whine. He had heard it twice before, once in the woods behind the high school when Ranger had found a missing hiker under a fall of red maple leaves, once in the parking lot behind the old Wagon Wheel Motel when the dog had led them to a duffel bag with a hand still in it. Both times a body had turned up before sundown. Both times without a single false alarm. "Grant," Sergeant McKellar had come up on his shoulder, low voice, small motion. "Whole procession stopped. Move him along, son. Not here. Not now." Sullivan crouched down. He put his hand under Ranger's chin, made the dog look at him, and saw nothing there but the flat-working focus of a K9 on scent. He straightened up. He looked at the sedan. And he did the thing he would think about later, as the moment his life turned. He walked over to the driver's window and rapped his knuckles on the glass. Reed rolled the window down with a small, tired smile. His eyes were red. His jaw carried the day's stubble. He looked like a man who had lost a brother, and to be fair to him, that was exactly what he wanted the world to see. "Everything okay, Grant?" "Dog spooked, Marcus." Sullivan kept his voice easy. "Just the crowd, probably. Give us a second. Take your time." Reed's eyes flicked to Ranger and back. That dog loved him more than anybody. "Yeah." Sullivan's tongue felt heavy. "Yeah, he did. Marcus, would you mind opening the trunk for me?" Reed's smile did not move exactly, but something behind it did. just the smallest tightening at the corners. The trunk. Just for a second. It's a funeral, Grant. I know. For our friend. I know that. The silence between them lasted maybe 3 seconds, and it felt like the length of a whole afternoon. Reed looked at the dog. The dog looked at the car. Sullivan looked at Reed's hands on the steering wheel, and he noticed for the first time that Reed's right thumbnail had a hairline split across it, the kind you got from prying at something with the wrong tool. "No," Reed said quietly. "I'd rather not, Grant. Not today. Not out here in front of Linda and the boys." He rolled the window back up. He nodded once, gentle and firm, the way you might nod at a child who was asking for something you could not give. Then he put the sedan in gear and eased away from the curb, slow enough that it did not look like fleeing, fast enough that he was gone before Sullivan had thought of what to say next. Ranger watched the car all the way to the intersection. Then he sat down in the middle of Elm Street, tucked his tail around his paws, and looked up at Sullivan with an expression that was almost patient, as if to say, "I told you. Now what?" McKellar cleared his throat. The procession had to move. The graveside was waiting. Sullivan bent, put his hand flat on the top of Ranger's warm head and murmured, "Later, boy. I hear you." Then he tugged the leash gently, and the shepherd rose and walked at his side, obedient again, past the hearse and past the folded silence of the town, and on toward the cemetery on the hill. But the thread had already been pulled. That night, Sullivan sat at his kitchen table in his undershirt with the funeral flowers still pinned over his heart, and he wrote 3 words on the back of a phone bill. Trunk. Refused. Why? He underlined the last one twice. Then he sat there for a solid hour, staring at nothing, while Ranger lay on the linoleum by the fridge and watched him with that same patient expression. Bishop had been dead 11 days. The story the department had told was clean. It was a Wednesday night. It was raining hard, the kind of Ohio spring rain that comes down in sheets and turns every pothole into a little lake. Bishop had been driving home from a late shift on County Road 12, a 2-lane ribbon of blacktop that ran between corn and soy for 8 miles before it hit the town line. Somewhere near the old Watson Bridge, his cruiser had left the road at speed and rolled twice down into the ditch. He had not been wearing his seatbelt, which had struck everybody as odd because Bishop was a stickler for the belt. But the coroner had noted a fresh bruise on the collarbone, consistent with belt failure, and let it stand. Bishop had died before the ambulance arrived. The coroner ruled it wet pavement and driver fatigue. The department buried him with honors. The world was supposed to move on. Sullivan pushed a hand through his hair and thought about the last time he had seen his friend alive. It had been 6 days before the crash. Bishop had come out to the range with him, ostensibly to sight in a new duty pistol, but he had spent the whole hour asking careful questions about the drug evidence locker. Who had access? Who had the audit sheets? When was the last time anybody had done a real physical count? Bishop had a voice for interrogating suspects and a voice for talking to friends, and that afternoon at the range he had used the interrogation voice on his friend, gently, the way you might sharpen a knife on a cloth. Sullivan had thought at the time it was just cop talk. Now he was not so sure. He picked up the phone and dialed Linda Bishop. She answered on the second ring, and her voice sounded like a coat that had been left too long in the rain. "Grant." "Ma'am, ma'am." She almost laughed. "You call me ma'am one more time, Grant Sullivan, I'll come over there and box your ears. What is it?" "Can I come by tomorrow? Coffee, maybe. I brought a casserole to the wake, and I don't think anybody actually ate it." There was a pause, then quieter, "Come, yes, come." He hung up. He sat with his hand on the phone for a long time. Ranger got up from the linoleum, walked over, and rested his heavy head across Sullivan's boot, the way he used to rest it across Bishop's, and Sullivan closed his eyes for one long second, and made his second promise of the week. "I hear you, boy. I hear you." Linda Bishop lived in a small blue house at the end of Poplar Lane, with a wooden porch swing that Adam had hung himself the summer after they moved in, and a wind chime made from old shotgun shells that his father had left him. Sullivan drove out there the next afternoon with a foil-covered casserole in the passenger seat and Ranger stretched across the back. He parked behind Linda's minivan and sat there for a full minute before he could make himself go up the steps. She met him at the door in a grey sweater 2 sizes too big for her, and she looked like she had lost 15 pounds in 11 days. She let him in without a word. The house smelled like coffee and dish soap and something else that he could not place at first, and then he realized it was Adam's cologne, and understood that she had probably sprayed it on a shirt to keep him near. Ranger came in behind Sullivan and stopped in the entryway, and then his tail moved once, slow, and he walked straight through the kitchen and lay down on the rug in front of Bishop's recliner. He put his chin on his paws. He closed his eyes. Linda watched him do it and pressed her fist against her mouth and did not make a sound. The Bishop boys were somewhere in the back of the house. Sullivan could hear them, or at least he could hear the low murmur of a video game paused. Danny was 17. Caleb was 14. They had both worn their father's spare dress uniform pieces to the funeral. Danny had worn the tie, Caleb had worn the tie clip, and neither of them had cried where anybody could see. Sullivan understood that particular silence. He had grown up with a father who had also worn a badge, and he knew what boys did with grief when they were not sure they were allowed to have it. He and Linda sat at the kitchen table with the casserole between them like a middleman. "Grant," she said finally, "you didn't drive out here to bring me a dish." "No, ma'am, I didn't." "Then tell me." He told her. He told her about Ranger stopping in the street. He told her about the black sedan. He told her about Reed refusing to open the trunk. He kept his voice level and did not say any of the words he was afraid to say, and Linda listened with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her eyes on the wall behind him. When he was done, she set the cup down. Her hand was shaking. She put the other hand on top of it to make it stop. "Grant," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "My husband was not afraid of a rainy road." He waited. "He was afraid of a friend." The kitchen went so quiet he could hear the refrigerator hum. Linda got up. She walked to the hallway closet, reached up to the top shelf behind a stack of towels, and came back with a small brown notebook wrapped in a rubber band. She set it on the table between them like it was something that might bite. "He kept this in his boot," she said. "In the boot he wore at home, the one he never took to work. I found it when I went to look for his good watch. I didn't read it. I was afraid to read it. But now you're going to look, and you're going to tell me what my husband died for." Sullivan slid the rubber band off. He opened the notebook. Adam Bishop's blocky handwriting filled every page in blue ink, dates and initials and dollar amounts and case numbers, and here and there a single word underlined twice. Reed, locker, missing, silver, Miller Road, meeting. He turned page after page. He did not read it out loud. Linda did not ask him to. When he closed the notebook, he put both hands flat on the table. "Linda," he said, and it was the first time he had ever called her by her first name. "If I take this and I run with it, I might lose my badge. I might lose worse. I need to know you want me to." "Grant Sullivan," she said, "if you don't take that book and run with it, don't ever come back to this house." Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway then. He was tall for 17, broad through the shoulders, like his father had been, and he was holding a bowl of cereal that he did not seem to remember was in his hands. He looked at Sullivan. He looked at the notebook on the table. He looked at his mother's face. "Uncle Grant," he said, in a voice that was already lower than it had been at the funeral. "Was it Reed?" Sullivan opened his mouth. He closed it. He did not know how to lie to a boy who had just buried his father. "I don't know yet, Danny," he said. "I mean to find out." Danny set the bowl on the counter. He walked over to the table. He put his hand on Sullivan's shoulder for one long moment. He did not say anything else. He went back down the hallway. A minute later, the video game unpaused. Sullivan drove home with the notebook tucked inside his jacket and Ranger's head resting on the console between the seats. And by the time he pulled into his driveway, he had made a plan. The first name on his list was Frank DeLoach. Frank was the mechanic who had winched Bishop's cruiser out of the ditch and towed it back to the county garage the morning after the crash. He had been a fixture at that garage for 22 years. He wore his grey hair in a ponytail and kept a picture of his 3 grandsons taped to the inside of his toolbox lid. Sullivan had gone to school with his oldest son, back when Frank had still been able to laugh out loud. That was the thing Sullivan remembered as he pulled into the garage lot at the end of the workday. Frank used to laugh out loud, and lately he did not. He found Frank in the back bay with his head under the hood of a rusted-out Buick. "Frank!" "Grant!" The mechanic did not look up. "Come to talk about the timing on the Bishop cruiser." Sullivan blinked. "How'd you know?" "Because you ain't come to see me for 8 months, and now you're here 2 weeks after Adam went in the ground, and I ain't stupid." Frank straightened up. He wiped his hands on the rag from his back pocket. His eyes were tired and a little wet. "I've been wondering when somebody was gonna come. I've been wondering who it would be. I hoped it would be you." "You told somebody something was wrong." "I told my supervisor. I told him twice. I told him the brake line had been notched, not cut, notched right at the fitting where it would blow under pressure. You wouldn't see it if you weren't looking for it. It'd read as a road failure 99 days out of 100. But I was looking because that cruiser was 3 months out of a full brake service, and I signed the sheet myself, and I know my work." Frank leaned back against the fender. "I told my supervisor. He told me it wasn't my job to speculate. He told me the coroner had ruled. He told me to write it up as consistent with impact damage and go home. Then he told me who was asking questions about the file." "Who?" "Marcus Reed." The garage was suddenly very cold. "Reed came here?" "Reed came here." Frank folded the rag. 2 days after the wreck. Told me he was following up for the family. Told me his heart was broken. Told me Adam wouldn't want me stirring up something that would just cause his widow more pain. Told me it was a wet road. Told me twice. Then he stood real close and put a hand on my shoulder and told me a 3rd time. Frank looked at Sullivan. "I got 3 grandsons, Grant. I got a wife whose sugar is bad. I ain't a brave man. I signed the paper. I went home. I sat on my porch that night, and I got so drunk my Barbara had to help me into the house, and I ain't slept right since. You're being brave right now. I'm being tired right now. There's a difference." Sullivan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook of his own. He wrote down every word Frank had told him, dates and times and phrases, and Frank watched him write and did not stop him. When Sullivan closed the notebook, he asked, "Would you say it under oath?" Frank was quiet for a long time. He looked at the picture of his 3 grandsons taped inside the toolbox lid. He looked at the concrete floor. "Ask me again," he said, "when you got somewhere to say it that won't get me killed." Sullivan drove out of the garage lot with his hands tight on the wheel and his heart running a little too fast. He drove past the elementary school where the kids were coming out of aftercare, past the post office where Bishop had once talked a suicidal veteran down off the roof, past the corner where Bishop had bought him a coffee every Monday morning for a year when Sullivan's daughter Emma was in the hospital with pneumonia. He drove past all of it and thought about how a whole town could feel like a courtroom and how the verdict was already being written by silence. He went to his captain the next morning. Captain Ellis Poole was a broad, quiet man 3 years from retirement, with hands the size of dinner plates and a photograph of a black lab named Duke on the credenza behind his desk. Duke had been his own K9 partner 16 years back, And Poole was one of the few men in the building who understood what Ranger meant to Sullivan and what Sullivan meant to Ranger. That was why Sullivan went to him first. It was the mistake he needed to make in order to know it was a mistake. He laid it out. He kept the notebook in his lap and did not mention it. He talked about Ranger at the funeral. He talked about the brake line. He talked about Reed's refusal at the curb. He was careful and he was measured. And when he was done, Captain Poole sat with his enormous hands folded on his desk and looked at him with such old, sad patience that Sullivan knew right then what the answer would be. Grant. Yes, sir. I'm going to say this to you as a friend. You understand? Yes, sir. You are grieving. You are also raising a K9 who is grieving. That dog is picking up on your suspicion, and you are picking up on the dog's grief, and the two of you are chasing each other around in a circle that is going to end badly for you both. Marcus Reed carried Adam's casket. Marcus Reed was there when Linda got the news, and he stayed at that kitchen table until dawn. Marcus Reed has 24 years with this department, and I am not going to open an internal investigation on him because your K9 sniffed at his car during a funeral procession. Captain, the brake line was examined, was signed off, is closed. Frank Deloach. Frank Deloach is a mechanic with a drinking problem. Poole's voice was still gentle. Whom you have now, I'll bet, gone and pressured. If Marcus Reed catches wind that you're going around this department accusing him of murdering his best friend Grant, and if he decides to file on you, I will not be able to save your badge. I want you to hear that. I will not be able to save it. Sir, stand down. Sullivan sat there for a long moment. He thought about the notebook in his jacket. He thought about Linda's shaking hand. He thought about Ranger on the linoleum by the fridge. He thought about Danny's hand on his shoulder in the kitchen doorway. Yes, sir, he said. I hear you. He left the captain's office. He walked down the long hallway past the caseboards and past the coffee pot with the burned bottom, and he went out to his cruiser and sat in it with the door closed. Ranger was waiting in the back cage. Sullivan opened the divider and let the dog crawl up front. He put his hand on Ranger's neck and left it there until his own hand stopped shaking. We're on our own, he said. Ranger licked his wrist once and then rested his chin across it. He drove home the long way. He did not go past Reed's house on purpose, but he did anyway, and the black sedan was parked in the driveway, and there was no reason for Sullivan to slow down as he passed, and he slowed down anyway. Reed's garage door was open. Reed was inside in a t-shirt, running a shop rag over the sedan's trunk lid with the concentration of a man polishing an altar. He did not look up. Sullivan drove on. That night, the internal affairs sergeant, a hard-eyed woman named Diane Krupke, who Sullivan had known since patrol school, called him at home and told him in careful language that a complaint had been filed. Reed had reported that Sullivan approached his personal vehicle at a departmental funeral, made accusatory statements, and behaved erratically. Krupke said this in the same voice she used to read Miranda. She said she was not opening a formal file. Yet. She said Sullivan needed to take a breath. She said the department was not the place to work out his grief. He thanked her. He hung up. He sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets and let Ranger lay his big shepherd head across his lap. And he stayed that way until the sun came up. Then he did something he had never in his life done before. He called in sick. The dispatcher on the line was a woman named Marcy, who had known him since he was a rookie. She did not push. She marked him down. She said gently that a lot of the guys were struggling with Bishop's death and there was no shame in taking a day. Sullivan thanked her and hung up and looked at Ranger and said, "All right, boy, now we go to work." The first 3 nights he sat outside Reed's house. He borrowed a beat-up Silverado from his brother-in-law so his cruiser would not be recognized. He parked 2 blocks down on the far side of an old oak tree with a thermos of black coffee and a pair of binoculars and Ranger curled up on the bench seat beside him. He watched the sedan. He watched Reed come and go. He watched the wife, Patricia Reed, carry a laundry basket to the mailbox one evening and stand there a long time before she made herself walk back inside. He learned things. He learned that Reed left the house every morning at 7:22, drove directly to the station, and did not stop anywhere in between. He learned that Reed came home at 6 on the dot, ate dinner, and then took the sedan out again around 9 to a bar called the Iron Griddle, 2 towns over. He learned that Reed drank exactly 2 beers at the Iron Griddle and never a third, that he sat at the same corner stool every time, and that he made 1 phone call from the parking lot before he drove home each time. The phone call lasted between 40 seconds and 2 minutes. Sullivan wrote all of it down in tight blue ink in a fresh notebook of his own. He also learned that Reed was scared. You could see it if you knew what to look for. Reed had lost weight. The suit that had fit him at the funeral hung a little now. He kept his cell phone in his hand instead of his pocket. He looked at his rearview mirror 3 times in the space of a single block. When he came out of the Iron Griddle on the 3rd night, he walked around his sedan twice before he got in, and he shone a flashlight underneath it before he turned the key. On the 2nd afternoon of the stakeout, Reed himself came out to Sullivan's parked truck. Sullivan almost had a heart attack. Reed walked casually down the sidewalk in a fleece jacket, hands in his pockets, a big neighborly smile on his face, and Sullivan barely had time to slide down in the seat before Reed knocked on the driver's side window. Sullivan rolled it down halfway. "Grant!" Reed leaned an elbow on the doorframe. His smile was easy. "You know what I saw. I saw a truck sitting on my block for the better part of 2 days, and I thought to myself, maybe somebody's casing a house, and then I thought I recognized it. That your brother's ride?" "Brother-in-law's." "Ah." Reed nodded. His eyes went past Sullivan to Ranger on the passenger seat and stayed there for a second too long. "How's the boy?" "Getting older. They do that. A beat. Grant, come inside. Have a beer. Patty's got a chicken on." "No, thank you, Marcus." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Reed's smile did not leave his face, but something behind his eyes went cold and steady, the same coldness Sullivan had seen in interrogation rooms, across from men who had done terrible things and were deciding whether to admit them. "Grant," he said quietly, "I loved him too." "I know you did, Marcus." "Do you?" "I know it the way you loved him." "Yes." Reed straightened up. He tapped the door frame twice with his knuckles. He walked back to his house without hurrying. Sullivan sat in the truck with his heart hammering, and Ranger pressed against his hip and understood, for the first time all the way through, that he was in real danger. He moved the truck. He parked on the far side of the neighborhood, behind a hedge on Willowbend Court, where he had a partial angle on the back of Reed's driveway through the gap between 2 houses. He kept the binoculars low. He drank the coffee cold. On the 4th night, Sullivan almost gave up. It was one of those long, cold Ohio nights that pretends to be spring, and then remembers it is still winter, and the wind came down off the fields and rattled the Silverado's windows, and Sullivan sat there with cold hands and a colder heart, and thought seriously about starting the engine and driving home and telling Linda he had done what he could. He had almost turned the key when Ranger sat up. The shepherd did not whine. He did not bark. He put both front paws on the dashboard and stared through the windshield at Reed's house, and every muscle in his body was suddenly awake and singing. Reed had come out of the house, not through the front door, through the side door. He was carrying something. Sullivan lifted the binoculars, a gym bag, blue, heavy enough that it pulled Reed's shoulder down. Reed put the gym bag in the trunk of the sedan. He closed the trunk quietly. He got in the driver's seat and pulled out of the driveway without turning on his headlights until he was 2 houses down the block. Sullivan followed him. Reed drove 5 miles north on the county highway. He turned onto a gravel access road that led into a stand of pines behind the old paper mill. He drove another half-mile in and stopped. Sullivan cut his lights, pulled onto the shoulder, and rolled the last 200 yards in neutral. He killed the engine. He watched Reed get out. He watched Reed lift the gym bag from the trunk. He watched Reed walk to a hollow at the base of a big pine and kneel down and lift a piece of plywood and lower the bag into the ground. Sullivan sat very still. Ranger sat very still. They watched Reed put the plywood back and scatter pine needles over it and stand up and dust off his knees. He stood there a long moment looking down at the covered spot, and even from that distance Sullivan could see the tired hunch of a man who was doing something he had done too many times. Reed drove home. Sullivan did not follow this time. Sullivan sat in the pines for another 20 minutes to be sure. Then he got out of the truck, walked to the plywood, and lifted it. The gym bag was heavy. He unzipped it right there under the pines by the light of his phone. Cash, bricked and banded, in what looked like about $40,000 in old 20s. Under the cash, a small plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be white powder, and under the plastic bag, a manila envelope with a rubber band around it. Sullivan opened the envelope with 2 fingers, careful not to smear any prints. Inside were pages torn from an audit log. Bishop's handwriting was in the margins, and clipped to the back was a photograph taken from across a parking lot with a telephoto lens of Marcus Reed handing a stack of banded bills to a lean man with a scar down one cheek and hair tied back in a red bandana. The lean man's name was written on the back of the photograph in Bishop's block letters: Silver, Miller Road, Tuesday. Sullivan put everything back exactly the way he had found it. He replaced the plywood. He scattered the pine needles. He went back to the truck. His hands were shaking so badly he could not fit the key in the ignition, and he had to wait a full minute before he could drive. Ranger sat beside him with his ears up, alert and quiet, waiting for the next order. He did not go to the captain. He did not go to internal affairs. He drove home. He fed the dog. He slept for 4 hours. Then at dawn, he drove 78 miles south to the county seat and asked to see the sheriff of the neighboring county. Sheriff Warren Ackerman had known Bishop's father, Elmer Bishop, since the two of them had been rookies in the state patrol together in 1971. Elmer had died of a heart attack when Adam was in high school, and Ackerman had come to the funeral in full uniform and had knelt down in front of a 15-year-old Adam and told him that if he ever needed a father, all he had to do was pick up the phone. Adam had never made that call, out of pride mostly, but Sullivan had heard the story from Bishop once over beers, and he had never forgotten it. Ackerman was 61 years old, built like a fence post, and he did not smile when Sullivan came into his office. He listened. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Sullivan's notes on the stakeout. He looked at Sullivan's phone photograph of the gym bag in the pines. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to his window and looked out at the courthouse square where a couple of pigeons were fighting over a piece of bread. Adam Bishop, he said finally, was my brother's boy in every way that mattered. Yes, sir. You bring me this on the word of a K9 and a mechanic and one photograph of a bag in the woods. Yes, sir. That's a hell of a thin case. Yes, sir. Ackerman turned around. His eyes were pale blue and very quiet. You know what I've had sitting in my top drawer for 2 years, Officer Sullivan? No, sir. A letter from Adam Bishop, handwritten, sent to me, personal, no return address, no signature until the last line. Just a letter that says, Sheriff Ackerman, I think we've got a problem in the Millbrook evidence locker. I don't want to raise a flag until I have proof. I'll come to you when I do. Yours, Adam. Sullivan sat very still. I wrote him back, Ackerman said. I told him to come see me any time. He never did. And then I heard that he'd gone off the road, and I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for 3 days, and I did not know what to do with it, because I could not prove a damn thing, and I did not want to go stirring up mud in another sheriff's yard on nothing but a letter and a bad feeling. He looked at Sullivan. And here you are. Yes, sir. It's enough for a warrant. Get some sleep, come back at 3. I'll have paper for you by then, and a judge to sign it who owes me a favor from the flood. Sullivan slept in his truck in the courthouse parking lot for 4 hours, with Ranger stretched across the bench seat and his hand on the dog's ribs. He came back at 3. By 5, they had the warrant. By 9 that night, they were rolling. They did it right. 3 unmarked county cars, no lights, no sirens. Ackerman rode in the lead car with Sullivan and Ranger. They pulled up at Reed's house at 9:40. The porch light was on. The sedan was in the driveway. The television was on inside. Sullivan could hear the low mumble of a baseball game from the sidewalk. Ackerman knocked. Reed opened the door in a t-shirt and pajama pants, with a beer in his hand, and his eyes went first to Ackerman's badge, then to Sullivan behind him, then to Ranger on the leash at Sullivan's side, and Sullivan watched all the color leave his face at once, top down, like a shade being pulled. "Marcus Reed," Ackerman said, "we have a warrant to search this residence and the vehicles on this property in connection with the death of Officer Adam Bishop." Reed did not run. He did not fight. He did not say anything at all. He handed the beer to Sullivan without looking at him, as if Sullivan were a coat check, and he stepped back and let them in. Patricia Reed came out of the kitchen with her hands still in a dish towel. She looked at her husband. She looked at the officers. She looked at Sullivan, and she sat down on the arm of the couch and did not stand up again for a very long time. Her lower lip was trembling in a way that was not quite grief and not quite fear, and Sullivan filed that away. They opened the trunk of the sedan first. Under the spare tire well was a shallow compartment lined with an old towel, and in the compartment was a tire iron. The tire iron was wrapped in a red shop rag. The rag had a dark stain along one edge and a lighter, oily smear across the middle. The lab would later confirm the dark stain was type A positive blood matching Adam Bishop. The oily smear was DOTI 4 brake fluid. Sullivan stood in the driveway with the trunk light shining up onto Reed's face and watched his old friend's oldest friend look at the tire iron and finally, at long last, close his eyes. Ackerman spoke very softly. "Marcus." "Yes." "Turn around, son. Hands behind your back." Reed turned around. Sullivan put the cuffs on him himself. His hands did not shake this time. Ranger stood at his side, silent, watching, his ears forward and his tail low, and when Reed was cuffed and read his rights and being walked toward the county car, the shepherd rose up on his hind legs one time and put his front paws on Reed's back. Just once, just for a second, and Reed made a small sound in his throat, like a boy who had lost something he had loved and had known he would lose the moment he stole it. Then Ranger dropped back down and walked with Sullivan to the car. At the county lockup, Reed asked for a lawyer, and then he asked for Ackerman, and then he asked for Sullivan. Sullivan went in alone. The interview room was grey and small and smelled like burned coffee. Reed sat with his cuffed hands on the table between them. His face looked older than Sullivan had ever seen it look, and for a strange moment, Sullivan saw the boy underneath the man. The boy Adam Bishop had once told him about, the boy who used to shoot hoops with Adam in an alley behind a laundromat when they were both 12 years old and neither of their fathers made much money. "Grant," Reed said. "Marcus." He was going to turn me in. Sullivan waited. "He came to me that night at the house. Patty was at her sister's in Toledo. He came into my kitchen with a folder, and he laid it on the counter, and he said, 'Marcus, we can drive to the sheriff right now, together. You come in with me. You give it up. I will stand next to you every step. But we drive tonight, and we drive together, and we do this the right way.'" Reed's voice was flat, hollowed out like a gourd. "I said no. He said yes. He said if I didn't come with him, he'd go alone in the morning. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He said this was love." "Marcus." "I hit him with the tire iron. I didn't plan to. I picked it up because it was on the counter. I'd been fixing the leaf blower and I hit him one time and he went down and he didn't get up. Reed's chin trembled once. He got control of it. I sat on my kitchen floor with him for an hour. I held his hand. I told him I was sorry. I told him I would fix it. Then I put him in his cruiser. I drove him out to Watson Bridge. I put him back in the driver's seat and I ran the cruiser off. I called Miguel Silva to come pick me up in the rain. A pause. Miguel notched the brake line before we sent it down, so it would read as a wet road accident. Miguel Silva. Miguel Silva. Where is he? He'll be at the Iron Griddle at 10. He always is on Fridays. He drinks a screwdriver at the corner booth by the jukebox. He carries a 9mm in his waistband. Please tell your people, I don't want anybody else hurt over me. Sullivan wrote it down. He stood up. He looked at his old partner's oldest friend one more time. Marcus, he said, when Ranger stopped in the street. What did he smell? Reed closed his eyes. Adam's blood, he said, on the rag. I hadn't washed it. I meant to. I never had the time, and every time I thought about washing it, I thought about the rag as the only piece of him I had left, and I could not put my hand on it. That's the truth. It's a filthy truth, and it's the truth. Sullivan walked out of the interview room. He walked down the hall to the men's room. He locked the door. He put both hands on the sink. He did not cry. He had promised himself twice now, and he had made it this far, and he was not going to break in a lock-up restroom over a man who had killed his friend. He took 3 long breaths. He splashed water on his face. He looked at himself in the mirror and told himself very quietly that he had done what Adam would have done. Then he unlocked the door and went back to work. Miguel Silva was arrested at the Iron Griddle at 10:14 that night without incident. He was on his second screwdriver. He surrendered his weapon without argument. He rolled on Reed inside an hour. He gave up 2 other officers on the department payroll, a lieutenant named Dwayne Buck, who had been running interference on the audit sheets, and a records clerk named Sonia Ortiz, who had been shredding paperwork on request. All 3 were arrested before dawn. Captain Poole, when he was called in, sat at his desk and looked at Sullivan for a long time and finally said quietly, "Grant, I owe you an apology." Sullivan said, "No, sir. You owe Adam one." Poole nodded. He did not disagree. He got up. He walked over to the window and stood there for a long time with his back to Sullivan, and his big shoulders were shaking, and Sullivan understood the man had loved Adam Bishop too, and had been fooled the way a lot of people had been fooled, and would carry that for the rest of his life. The news broke in the county paper on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the state attorney general had assigned a special prosecutor from Columbus. By Friday, Marcus Reed was on suicide watch at the county jail. By the following Monday, he had signed a plea agreement in exchange for a full and truthful statement, and by the end of the month, he had told everything he knew about a small, ugly ring of theft from the evidence locker that had been running quietly inside the Millbrook department for 6 years. The take was small by big city standards, maybe $200,000 over that time, in bricks of seized cash that were never officially logged, sold quietly back to Miguel Silva's people at 50 cents on the dollar. It had all been going along smoothly until Bishop, doing a routine audit as the department's newly appointed evidence sergeant, had noticed a discrepancy in the paperwork and had started to pull the thread. Bishop had done what Bishop always did. He had gone to his friend. He had thought his friend was clean and would help him find whoever was dirty. He had trusted the wrong man, and the wrong man had loved him too much to let him go and not enough to save him. Patricia Reed came forward on her own before the trial. She sat in the district attorney's office with her hands folded in her lap and her voice very small, and she said that she had known something was wrong for 2 years. She had found cash in her husband's sock drawer she could not explain. She had confronted him. He had told her a story about a bonus program, and she had made herself believe it because she was afraid of what would happen if she did not. Then, after Bishop's death, she had found the tire iron in a garbage bag in the garage. She had confronted him a second time. He had grabbed her by the throat and pushed her against the refrigerator and told her that if she ever spoke a word, he would tell everyone she had helped him plan it, that no jury would believe otherwise, that she would lose the house and their reputation and their whole life. She had believed him. She showed the fading marks on her throat. A photographer took pictures under a bright lamp. She wept in a way that suggested she had not wept in a long time. And Sullivan, sitting outside the office in the hallway with Ranger at his feet, listened through the door and understood that this whole story had many more victims than a single fallen officer. She had one more thing to give them. In her linen closet, in a shoebox under the folded winter sheets, she had a small digital recorder. 6 months earlier, in a moment when her hands had stopped shaking long enough to think, she had turned the recorder on and slid it into her apron pocket and gone into the kitchen to ask her husband a simple question. He had answered it the way he answered everything now, with menace under the surface, and every word of that conversation was on the recorder. She had never played it for anyone. She had thought she never would. She gave the recorder to the prosecutor. It played for 11 minutes. On the recording, her husband explained in the calm, careful voice of a man discussing a mortgage exactly what he had done to Adam Bishop and exactly why, and threatened his wife with prison and public shame if she ever spoke of it. When the recorder was turned off, no one in the room spoke for a long time. The prosecutor finally cleared his throat and told Patricia Reed she would not be charged with anything, and that her name would not appear in the papers if she did not wish it to, and that she would be safe. She thanked him, and she left. She drove herself home. She packed a suitcase. She moved out of the house on Willow Bend Court that night and went to live with her sister in Toledo. She would not sleep another night under Marcus Reed's roof. Marcus Reed pleaded guilty in the spring to voluntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, theft in office, and 1 count of assault against his wife. The judge, who had known Adam Bishop personally and had once been prosecuted for a traffic ticket by Bishop's father, sentenced him at the high end of every range and stacked them consecutively. Reed would not see the outside of a state prison until he was 71 years old if he lived that long. Miguel Silva got 15 years in federal. Lieutenant Dwayne Buck lost his pension and got 8. Sonia Ortiz cooperated fully and got 3 years of probation, 600 hours of community service, and the shame of a small town that did not forget easily. The Millbrook Department got its own audit. 6 procedures got rewritten. The evidence locker got cameras and a 2-key system and a rotating audit by the county comptroller. Captain Ellis Poole announced his retirement early and told the town at a small ceremony in the community center that he was proud to have served and that he was sorrier than he could say. He shook Sullivan's hand for a long time at the door and did not let go until the younger officer looked him in the eye and said, "It's all right, Cap. It's all right." The new captain was a woman named Elena Diaz, who had come up through the ranks in Cleveland and had asked for the Millbrook Post specifically. She was 39, quiet, and she had a way of listening that made people tell her the truth. Her first act as captain was to walk the entire department through the evidence locker one at a time and show them, with her own 2 hands, how the new logs would work. Her second act was to promote Sullivan to sergeant. He tried to refuse. She would not hear it. She said the department needed him and needed to be seen needing him, and that was the end of the conversation. Linda Bishop received Adam's full pension. She received his back pay. She received a settlement from the department for the wrongful cover-up of the initial accident report. She used part of the money to pay off the little blue house at the end of Poplar Lane, and part of it to send the 2 Bishop boys, Danny and Caleb, to a state university where their father would have wanted them to go. The rest she put in the bank and did not touch. She told Sullivan once, over coffee at her kitchen table, that money was not the same as a husband, and she did not want to confuse the two. She said it with the small, hard smile of a woman who had learned to survive. The town of Millbrook held a memorial for Bishop that summer at the little park by the river. Half the town came. Danny read a short piece he had written about his father. Caleb played Amazing Grace on a beat-up trumpet he had learned in middle school band. The mayor unveiled a red maple sapling planted in Bishop's name and a small stone at its base. The stone said, "Adam Bishop, officer, husband, father, friend, 19 years of service, beloved." It did not say anything about how he had died. It did not need to. Everyone there knew. Sullivan spoke last. He kept it short. He said Adam Bishop had been the sort of man who did not know how to be anything but honest, and had loved his friends the way honest people love their friends, which was too much, and had paid for it. He said the town had lost more than an officer. He said any of us could be Adam. He said any of us could be Marcus. He said the only difference in the end was which one we chose to be when nobody was watching. He said this while looking straight at his own police brothers in the front row, and none of them looked away. Then he sat down, and Ranger walked up to the podium on his own, without a leash, and stood there in front of the stone with his ears up and his tail slow, and did not move for a full minute. The crowd did not make a sound. When the shepherd was ready, he turned around and walked back to Sullivan and sat down at his feet, and that was the end of the memorial. Ranger retired that summer. The department wanted to give him a big ceremony with a plaque and a speech from the mayor, but Sullivan asked quietly if they could keep it small. They did. It was Sullivan and Linda and the Bishop boys, and Sheriff Ackerman and Captain Diaz and Sergeant McKellar and Frank Deloach, who had testified at Reed's plea hearing and stood there in a borrowed suit with his hair combed and his hands shaking, and told the truth in a small, clear voice. They stood on the concrete pad behind the K9 unit, and Diaz read a short citation, and Sullivan clipped the leash to Ranger's collar one last time as a working dog, and then, in front of everyone, unclipped it. He knelt down in front of the shepherd, put a hand on either side of his big, warm head, and said, "You're off duty, boy. You're home." Ranger licked his chin. Then he walked, slow and easy, over to Linda Bishop, and he put his head in her lap, where she sat on the folding chair, and he did not move for a long time. Linda buried her face in the fur of his neck. Danny looked down at his shoes. Caleb did not bother hiding his tears anymore. Frank Deloach came up to Sullivan afterwards. He was still wearing the borrowed suit and holding a paper cup of coffee somebody had pressed into his hand. "Sergeant," Frank said. "Frank, I want you to know something." "Yes, I sleep now." Frank's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "Not perfect, but I sleep. My Barbara says I don't grind my teeth anymore. Ain't drunk since the day I testified. That's 4 months this Sunday." "Frank, I just wanted you to know." Sullivan nodded. He did not trust himself to say anything. He put his hand on the mechanic's shoulder for a long moment. Frank walked off across the parking lot to his old pickup, walking straight, walking a little lighter than he had walked in a very long time. The day Sullivan took Ranger home for good, it was raining. A soft evening rain, the kind that made the whole town smell like clean stone. Sullivan drove out from the station with the shepherd stretched across the back seat and the wipers ticking slow, and he took the long way, the way that ran past Elm Street. He slowed as they passed the corner where the funeral procession had stopped 9 months before. He looked at the curb where Reed's sedan had been parked. He looked at the piece of asphalt where Ranger had planted his paws and refused to move. He said very quietly, "Adam, we got him." Ranger's head lifted from the seat behind him. The shepherd looked at him in the rearview mirror. Then the dog put his head back down and closed his eyes. Sullivan drove home. He carried Ranger's water bowl and his blanket into the kitchen and set them by the fridge where Ranger liked to sleep. He fed the dog. He fed himself. He sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at the wall for a long time. He thought about a lot of things that night. He thought about how a friend can be a liar and a lie can wear the face of a friend. He thought about how a badge is only as clean as the smallest man wearing it. He thought about Frank Deloche, who was tired and not brave, and had done a brave thing anyway. He thought about Patricia Reed, who had lived with a monster because she was afraid of him and had walked into a district attorney's office anyway. He thought about Linda Bishop, who had shaken so hard her coffee spilled and had still handed him a notebook and said, "Run." Mostly he thought about a dog. He thought about how Ranger had stood in the middle of Elm Street with the whole town watching and had refused to look away. How the dog had known. How the dog had not needed a courtroom or a warrant or a lab report. How the dog had known because he had loved a man, and because he had loved that man, he could still smell him 101 days after he had died, and because he could still smell him, he had done the one thing an animal knows how to do when a bad man tries to walk away with the memory of a good one. He had refused, gently, stubbornly, in the middle of the street, in front of everybody. Sullivan reached down and put his hand on Ranger's back. The shepherd was warm and slow breathing under his palm. "Good boy," he said. "Good boy." Linda Bishop kept Adam's badge on the mantelpiece the rest of her life, in a small oak shadow box behind a pane of clean glass. Next to the badge, she framed a photograph of Ranger asleep on the living room rug, with his big square head resting across the toe of one of Adam's work boots. In the photograph, Ranger's eyes were closed and one ear was flopped over, and if you looked at the picture long enough, you could almost hear the dog snoring. Every year on the anniversary of Adam's death, Sullivan drove out to Poplar Lane with Ranger in the back seat and a small bunch of yellow flowers on the passenger side. And Linda made coffee, and the three of them sat on the porch swing that Adam had hung and watched the sun go down over the little blue house. Danny and Caleb came home when they could, and when they couldn't, they called. They did not talk much on those visits. There was not much left to say. Ranger got old in those years, slower and grayer around the muzzle, but every year when Sullivan pulled into that driveway, the shepherd still lifted his head and wagged his tail one time, remembering. The last thing to say is a small thing. The day after Reed's plea, before the news had fully broken, Sullivan drove out to Poplar Lane one more time. He knocked on Linda's door. He held Adam's small brown notebook in one hand and a plain envelope in the other. She let him in. He sat down at the kitchen table. He slid the notebook across to her. "He kept this in his boot," Sullivan said, "because he loved you. He wasn't going to bring anything home that could hurt you. Not until it was over. He wanted to be sure. That's who he was. He wanted to be sure before he made you carry any of it." She took the notebook in both hands. She held it against her chest. "And he loved a friend," she said. "That's what killed him, that he loved a friend." "Yes, Ma'am." "Grant." "Yes, Ma'am. You loved him too." He could not answer. He nodded. Linda reached across the table and put her hand on his. She squeezed it once. Then she got up and went to the counter and poured him a cup of coffee, and she brought it back and set it in front of him. And she sat down and did not let go of his hand for a long time. Outside, on the rug in front of Adam's recliner, Ranger dreamed. His paws moved a little in his sleep, the way a dog's paws move when it is chasing something in a good place, and his tail thumped once, softly, against the wood floor. Elm Street on the day of the funeral had been the last silence before a good man was going to be forgotten. A shepherd, with a good nose and a stubborn heart, had planted his paws in the middle of that silence and had refused to let it happen. Everything after, the notebook and the mechanic and the pines and the tire iron and the confession in the small grey room, had come from that one moment when a dog would not move. Sullivan believed that. He would believe it the rest of his life. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, Take a moment to like it and tell me in the comments what part of it hit you hardest. I read everyone. And if you're new here, come along and subscribe, because we tell true-hearted stories like this one every week, and there's a seat here for you at the table.